Welcome to episode 29 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes. It's late February 2021 and I've spent much of the past week or so watching the online talks and films that have been taking place as part of the virtual Cycle Touring Festival. The event is normally held in Clitheroe in the spring of each year. The first event was held in 2015 and it's been taking place every year since. I've been attending since 2016 and it's been a fantastic opportunity to meet up with like-minded people. It's more than just the talks and presentations, it's the conversations that take place and the contacts that are made. There are people who I first met back in 2016 who I now consider to be good friends. Alas, for obvious reasons, the events of 2020 and now in 2021 were pushed online, but I sincerely hope that come the spring of 2022 we'll all be back in Clitheroe, swapping stories about what we've been up to on our travels. Many of the participants at the Cycle Touring Festival over the years have also appeared in this podcast. Tim and Laura Moss, who organised the festival, Tim McKenna, Barry Godin, Paul Cheese, Anna Hughes, Caroline Burrows, the Gears for Queers duo of Abigail Morton and Lilith Cooper, Rob Ainsley, Frank Burns, Dr. Stephen Fabes. The podcast has even featured the one and only Timmy Mallet, who rounded off this year's online festival, talking about his cycle to Santiago de Compostela in Spain. If you have no idea who Timmy Mallet is, by the way, you're either too young or perhaps too old. Google him. Two other people who appeared at this year's festival were Catherine Dixon and Rachel Marsden. Together they cycled around the world on a tandem, in the process breaking the world record. They'll hopefully be featuring in an upcoming episode of the podcast, so watch, or rather keep listening, to this space. If you enjoy listening to the Cycling Europe podcast, by the way, please think about hitting the like button or even giving the podcast a rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you happen to be listening. Thanks if you do. To this episode of the podcast, and another person to have been part of the Cycle Touring Festival, Markus Stitz, the Scottish-based cyclist, adventurer and filmmaker. I started by asking him to introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Markus Stitz. I am the founder of Bikepacking Scotland, around the world cyclist, and possibly describe myself as an adventurer slash filmmaker slash writer. So very different hats on most of the times. But I enjoy cycling. That's possibly why I'm here. I love doing some nice and adventurous stuff on two wheels and documenting that in pictures and words and films.
Right, you're based currently in Scotland, and perhaps you can, in a few moments, you can say why or explain why or how you ended up in Scotland. But you were brought up in Germany, and that is relevant to something that we're going to talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah. I was born in East Germany, which I think that's a very important bit. So I was, as a child, I grew up in a country up until 10 years old, where there wasn't really much freedom, especially no freedom of speech or things like this. And I think this is something that, looking back now, I'm just above ledged about the 40. That's something that's been a very important theme in my life, and it's also encouraged me to do cycle touring slash bikepacking slash cycling, because I think for me cycling in any shape or form is very much personal freedom for me. It gets me to places, and I think gaining this, looking back, the fall of the Iron Curtain or the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, that was the year where I gained this freedom, and I think it is something which I value very highly, and I think it's very much reflected in all of the work I'm doing. It's about encouraging people to, just to see cycling as a way of personal freedom and being able to do things you want to do.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, I suppose, that so many of us in a place like Britain have no conception of what it's like growing up in a country where you can't just do what you want. But we'll come back to that, because that does tie in with the cycle that you did in Germany a couple of years ago. But how did you end up in Scotland?
Is a long, short story. I think the reason for that is I went to university and we had an exchange agreement, and I was at the University of Sunderland for half a year, and that was I've been to the UK a few times beforehand, but that was my real introduction to the UK, and with Sunderland being so close to Scotland. I travelled up to Edinburgh a number of times on the train and really liked Edinburgh as a city. It's just, I think the first time I set my foot into the city, I thought like, wow, this is amazing. Like it's just very much fairy tale city in a way. I think especially if you come from Germany, like I hadn't seen anything like this before, and that was my first view of Edinburgh was the castle, but also like the buildings of the new town, and it's just wonderful to see a place where so much building structure is still existent. So yeah, I loved Scotland. I fell in love in Edinburgh. I thought like I'd like to come back here eventually if I can. So I had an opportunity in 2005 after an internship in New York. I had about a month to spend before going back to university, and thought like this is the month where the Edinburgh Fringe happens, so there will be some short-term employment opportunities of some shape or form. So I applied for a job. It was a super quick decision. I had to get myself over to Scotland and within 2 days to start the job. And yeah, then came back pretty much every summer. So that was in 2005. I worked there in 2006, 2007, 2008, and then moved to New Zealand for 2 years. So even when I was in New Zealand, I came back the first year for the summer and worked at the Fringe Festival. And like I love the outdoors aspect of New Zealand. It's a beautiful country. It's a bit like Scotland on steroids. I think if you like it's a bit like Scotland, but the mountains are just a little bit more high and the sea is a little bit wilder and but essentially they're very similar places. So I thought like I could, I'd want to move back to Europe, but I'd like to have the same kind of adventure playground in a sense, and Scotland offers exactly that. So when I had a job offer at the Edinburgh International Festival, it was yeah, again, quick decision, go over, and then it was meant to be like a 2-month job, and then it was extended, and then I had a period where I was just readjusting myself a little bit, and then stayed in Scotland.
Have you always been a cyclist? You talked about, being in America, obviously being in
Mhm.
Germany, being in New Zealand. Has cycling been something that you've always been involved with?
Yeah, in a sense. I mean, I learned cycling pretty late because as a child, I was not sporty at all, to be frank. Like, if you imagine me as a child, I'd be the child who sitting in his pajamas, either staring in his stamp collection or playing with Lego and creating weird and wonderful things. And I learned to cycle eventually because where I grew up in Germany, like everyone cycled. There's just a basic thing. There was just no question. Like we did everything by bike if we could. We only had one car, so my parents didn't have the luxury to both be using a car. So me and my mum cycled. That was it. We had a small garden outside of town, and that was pretty much my cycling. I was just bumping around on a bike with my friends, and then I think I had this brief moment when we moved away from the town we were living into the countryside, and the school was about 15 kilometers away, and that's where I kind of like I think it was the first time where I really got a little bit of a cycling bug, saying to my parents, I'd like to have a proper bike, so I can cycle to school every now and then, which I did, but on very few occasions, and back then 15 kilometers seemed like a round the world journey to me. I think it was a massive achievement cycling to school. I think where I really caught the bug then. So I was, my background is very, very different from possibly other people who've went to like cycling in a club structure or something like this. I've never had that, and to be frank and honest, I never had an interest in that. And when I moved to a town called Ilmenau in the Thuringian Forest, in Germany, I had a wonderful place to live actually, on the outskirts of town, next to the forest. I basically had a mountain bike trail right at my front door. And for the first year, I didn't do any exercise whatsoever. It's just eating junk. And I think there came a point where my mum mentioned, "Hey, you need to do something about this. Otherwise, you gain too much weight while you're at university." And I think I started running, and after a couple of months of running, got a little bit bored of it. I'm not saying that running is boring, but I think I think like for me, I just wanted to get a little bit out. So yeah, got myself a proper mountain bike and started mountain biking. And I think that was there was no way back from there. Ever since then, like it's been part of my life. There were times in between, like as I mentioned, when I went to Edinburgh in 2005 or in Sunderland, for example, I didn't have a bike, and back then it really wasn't really a problem. But when I moved to New Zealand, for example, I packed nothing really after I had packed my bike. So the bike was first to put in a box, and then I scrambled together some clothes and made myself to the airport. And I think my mum got a little bit freaked out by that. It was just like, you don't want to take anything more. And I was like, oh, well, it's just, I take the stuff I need for cycling, and I can buy all the other things over there. So, and yeah, it stayed with me.
I think it's not uncommon for people to. I mean, you mentioned you weren't part of a club or anything like that, but actually, I think probably cycling intrinsically is an activity that is perfect for people who are, quite independent, who like their own space, who don't necessarily want to always be with a group of people. So I think it's probably more normal to become a cyclist like you did, like I did, like I think most people who go off on journeys, short, long journeys. I would imagine most of them probably didn't do that route of joining a club and going off in a big group at the weekend. I think intrinsically it's quite an independent thing to do, and it suits the personality of somebody who is happy to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I always think the fascinating thing about cycling is that it's a mode of transport and an activity at the same time. So it gets you places, and this is coming back to the freedom. I think it gives you, for me, like I also don't see myself, I wouldn't describe myself as a cyclist. I drive my car, and I don't own a car at the moment, but I also walk and do other things, and I enjoy them too. So I wouldn't define myself about being on the bike, but I think it's one of those very few things that actually enable you to go places. Like ultimately, you can go around the world on a bike. Of course, you have to take some other modes of transport in between to get from continent to continent. But I think it'd be very difficult to ski around the world or to surf around the world or anything like this. So I think in that aspect, cycling is amazing. And then I've always been a self-taught person, and that worked really well as well in that instance. So, I think the way I learned mountain biking, for example, is just to simply go out there and have a go at it. And you come off a few times, and you adjust things and you'll do it better the next time. But it's the nice thing with cycling is you can do that. You don't really need any other things to enable you to do that. You can just kind of have a go at it and eventually get better at it. And yeah, I think that's a nice thing to do.
Right. So you wouldn't define yourself as a cyclist, but clearly that is a big part of your life. Also, the filmmaking is a big part of your life, and we'll come to
Yeah.
that in a second. But the first time I heard about you was because I live in the Calder Valley in Yorkshire, and one of my local bike shops down Blazing Saddles down in Hebden Bridge,
Yeah.
they advertised an evening where you were coming to speak. So I thought, oh, I'll buy a ticket.
Yeah.
And the thing that attracted me, I think, to that talk was the fact that you weren't just somebody who was coming to talk about cycling around the world. You'd actually done it on a single speed bike. And that was the thing I thought, this guy must be crazy. And I came along, and I can still remember sitting in that room watching you. And I think we did have a brief chat at the very end. You probably don't remember. I just came away from that evening thinking, this guy has clearly got a screw loose. Why would he go around the world on a single speed bike? So can you just talk about that journey and the motivation for doing it on a single speed bike?
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I think it's kind of looking back to my childhood, and I've been reflecting about this quite recently when I started working on the last film. I think when I grew up in East Germany, for me, it was a perfectly normal life we led. And it was a perfectly normal life. Like there was nothing missing in my childhood. I had toys, I had food, I had a lovely family, but what wasn't like, I think from a very few point onwards, there was we could just not go to the shops and buy things, so we had to make do with the things we had. And I learned cycling on a 28-inch women's bike from my mum, which was way too big for me back in the days. Imagine this tiny little boy and there was a single speed bike as well. And so, from as a child, single speed riding was what I did because there were no bikes with gears. Bikes with gears in East Germany were very hard to get by. I remember my brother had one with, I don't know how many gears he had on his bike, but very few. But I think the way I got into single speeding was when I came back from New Zealand, and I wanted to do a trip back home in winter of 2010. And this is quite topical because we just, I think the winter we had in Edinburgh this year is very similar to the winter we had in 2010. And for me, it was important to do the trip. And it was like with anything I'm doing as well, I am a sort of person who wants to finish things. So I enter races because I want to cross the finish line, not just to have a crack at it and, eventually get there after a couple of attempts. So I think that's something I've got in me. So how can I actually cut out all the noise? How can I make this as simple as possible, so mechanically as simple as possible, that actually I don't have the excuse not arriving there because my bike broke or anything like this? And that's when I got into single speed riding. I've been exposed to it beforehand because when I lived in New Zealand, in Wellington, there's a really, really active cycle career scene. And a lot of the cycle careers over there, they just ride single speeds because it's the easiest maintainable bike. Like there's nothing really breaking on that. And those bikes, they get a really hard time. So, I was always looking at some of my friends who were into single speed. I was just like, this is bonkers. This is why would you? But
And that's the problem, isn't it? There's one thing going around Auckland or Wellington or wherever you are, which presumably is fairly flat on a single speed bike. But then you think, all right, hang on a second, I'm going to go around the world. I'm going to use a single speed bike. I'm not going to use a bike with any gears. Weren't you at least a little bit kind of, oh, this is dangerous territory?
no, not really. I think it was mainly the people around it who kind of tried to say, look, it can't be done. And I thought, like, give me a plausible reason why it can't be done. And no one could come up with a reason like this. And I think for me, I'm not the best poster boy for the bike industry as such, because I really love the simplicity of a bicycle, and I think we made something that has been originally been super simple. Take I'm riding a Claude Butler from the 1970s, and that's a bike you can still ride. That's 50 years old, and it's still a bike. And we made something that was super simple into something very complicated. And there are good reasons for that. I'm not against e-bikes or anything like this. I think it's brilliant. This is technology eventually enables more people to do things, and it's the same with cycling. But for me, I think there is still a very big fascination of the purity of cycling, that you can do something really big with something really small. And that was, in a sense, that's reflected in the single speed trip around the world. What you need is a bike that's important, but you don't need a bike that's overly complicated. And for me, that trip was not so much a cycling trip. It was for me taking a year off from a very busy and at times, yeah, really, really work-intensive career I had up until then. I used to work for Scottish Swimming as a marketing manager. I worked at events, so my life up until then, and the 3 years beforehand, was basically spending half of my year weekends at events. And for me, that trip was about, look, I'm gonna take a year off, and I really want to have some time for myself. I want to think about things, and I want to make a decision, where eventually I'm want to head with my life. And what I didn't want is to actually care about like a complex bike that could break. I wanted something as simple as possible. And I remember when I had this conversation with Pat Jocelyn, who used to be the brand manager for Surly in the UK. Um, because we had this conversation whether I'm going to stick gears on the bike or not. And he was like, "Why would you? Why would you make your life more difficult than you have to do? You've obviously ridden single speed for five. I've ridden 5 years at single speed in Scotland beforehand, so I know what it's like to get up a 20% hill. I also know that you kind of have to push at times. That's just part of the game." So I thought, like, it's not going to be that more complicated than riding in Scotland. So there was a good benchmark, and yeah, the decision was, for me, it was pretty easy, and it's also, I think that comes back to mindset. If you only have a single gear, you very quickly adjust to that. You adjust your riding technique to it. Um, you know how to approach hills, and I was by no means taking an easy route, because I wanted to take a route which gets me into interesting places and not just along plain boring highways. And yeah, it's fascinating. Like, I would say, even when I started, I didn't start with this thought in mind, oh, I'm missing 27 gears now here. That is not the case. I was just like, I'm actually quite happy. This is a bike, I can literally put outside the tent each night, have to put some chain loop on a chain every now and then, and that's it. That's all I need to care about. And I can spend the rest of my time actually wondering which people I want to meet, get a bit more immersed into the places I'm going to instead of having to worry how to maintain my bike.
You cycled 34,000 kilometers through 23 countries, averaged 130 kilometers a day, I think. But you did it over the course of a year. You weren't in any kind of rush to do it by the sounds of it. Was it more of a physical or a mental challenge?
I think both. I think the physical challenge is quite an easy thing, because I think if you're out on a trip like this, once you've ridden your bike for 2 weeks, then that just becomes a habit, a normal activity. And I did some pretty long days. The second day was the longest days, because I had to make the single speed championships in Yorkshire. And I hadn't really, planning wasn't the priority for the trip. Yeah, physically, I'm the sort of person who thinks, like, riding a bike is not rocket science. It involves turning your legs. And, if you've got some sort of training beforehand, then you'll be fine to do it. I mean, I would possibly not suggest starting cycling on day one and then trying to get around the world. That's a different thing. Mentally, very different ball game, because I think it needed a lot of adjustment around the trip, because I was going into this with a more race mindset, having done like things like the Highland Trail 550, for example, where you really, in a sense, put your head down to arrive at a place, and just make sure that you're in a state, or it's a bit personal safekeeping in a way, that you find a semi-okay place to sleep and then you crack on as quick as possible. And I think I did pretty much exactly that for the first month, and then I thought to myself when I arrived in Barcelona, hold on, this is not, this is possibly not what I wanted the trip to be. I wanted to have a bit more time to explore things. I think the distances I did on the long days on the bike I did were perfectly fine, because I had set out to cycle. That was it. I wasn't going on anything else. But I just wanted to give myself a little bit more time. So I changed my approach slightly, when I arrived in Barcelona, and kind of looked at, and I think mentally the whole thing got thrown over when my dad died. I was in the middle of, like, I was going over the US, and that at times is mentally quite challenging, because you're in some pretty desolate landscapes, and like, I love desolate landscapes, but they also give you a lot of time to think about things, and sometimes you get caught up in this kind of thinking too much, because, like, in a sense, it's good just to switch your brain off and go along. Yeah, so I had a call from my brother, when I was in New Mexico, that my dad had been airlifted to hospital because he had an accident, and the only thing I knew, that he had severe head injuries, and all of this didn't sound good. And so I made, but like, there was absolutely no decision to make other than leaving my bike in a safe place, jumping on the next flight back to Germany, and then I spent about 3.5 weeks walking in and out of hospital. And eventually my dad didn't make it. And then going back after an experience like this was obviously pretty tough. And it's more tough from a sense that I felt like I'm going to leave my family behind with the grief. And I've got the luxury to leave all of that behind, jump on my bike and continue my trip. And for me, that felt utterly selfish. But we had a discussion about this, and, my brother, my sister, my mom, and I, and they all encouraged me to go out there. And I think what was the tipping point was my mum was saying, look, if you're going out, continuing your trip, at least I've got something to look forward to each day. I can look at your dot, and I've been sending some pictures every now and then. So I thought, like, yeah, okay, that's possibly the right thing to do, because I always wanted to do this trip, and it's a very different trip right now, but it's still, in a sense, the two things were very unrelated. So I think the mental challenge is much bigger than the physical challenge. Like, there wasn't a single time I didn't take a single painkiller in a year, not a single ibuprofen whatsoever. And there was, like, I think the only concern I initially had from a physical point of view is how my knees are holding up with the single speeding. Again, not a single twitch at all. The nice thing about single speeding is you ride very consistent. If you look at my average times across the whole world, there isn't any dips in there. Mentally, totally different ball game there, especially after the death of my dad. There were times where, I thought, why am I doing this? And then, but that's quite normal. I think you also have those times if you live a normal. I just don't like the word normal, because I don't know what normal is. But I think you'll have ups and downs regardless if you're cycling around the world or not. That's just a normal thing, and I think they just possibly get a little bit amplified if you're by yourself in a desolate landscape like the Mojave or the Nullarbor Desert. But on the other hand, you learn to deal with those things, and I think that's the crucial thing. It never got that bad that I said I'm going to throw the towel. It always kind of came to a point where I just continued, and we eventually made it around.
It's interesting, isn't it? That I think anybody who sets off on a long journey and they know that they're going to be away for weeks, months, in your case, a year, you are aware of the fact that you might have to make a decision about continuing your trip based upon things that have happened back at home. And it must be a terrible moment, because obviously you're dealing with whatever the issue is, but also there must be something in you that says, well, actually, I do want to make sure this thing continues as well. So yeah, I've never been in that position fortunately, to have to make that decision, but it must be a tough decision to make.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing that I would say possibly in my life before I was pretty plain sailing, and eventually something like this might happen. There's a possibility, and I think the question is how you deal with it in the moment, and I think that's the tricky thing for me. For me, it was a pretty easy decision back then when I talked to my brother and I knew this is head injuries involved and my dad's in a coma. Like, yeah, there is really no decision to make whether I'm going to continue or not. Because I think the thing to consider as well, like that, I think whatever we do impacts in some shape or form on other people. And obviously, if I look at my family back in the situation, even if I would have been still riding my bike, because my brother said you don't really have to come back immediately, but I was just like, there's no question about this. I'm gonna book the next flight. It still took about 3.5 days to eventually get back, because I was in the middle of nowhere. But what I've learned on the round the world trip, and I think that's the most important thing, and this is just looking at the times we're in at the moment. I think you just have to accept the fact that there's only so much in life you can plan. There's things that just happen. I don't think it's good and necessary to plan with the worst case scenario. When I set off in the trip, I did set off with the best case scenario possible. And this is why I think if you look at my packing, if you look at my attitude to the whole trip, I set off in Edinburgh doing a lap of the world and arriving in Edinburgh within a year's time. That was pretty simple, but that was what in the back of my head. I didn't tell everyone doing that because I didn't want to put myself under the pressure of that other people know what my plan is, and I kind of have to fit within that. I think if you accept the fact that you can only plan so much, I think that's the most essential ingredient in the trip, because it makes you live in the present, it makes you enjoy the moment, and I think that the what you very quickly find out on a trip like this, there are amazing days and there's shit days. That's quite normal, as in everything else. And normally, if you have a super amazing day, the next day is going to be at best average because you just had a really good day, and it's just the kind of thing. But it's important that you really enjoy the really good day, because the average day is going to be there and it's also going to be gone pretty soon as well, and there's going to be another this thing. So and I was really glad that I like the way I approached the trip. I didn't have a set route. I had a rough idea where I wanted to go, but pretty much everything else happened on the way. There were people I met who gave me recommendations. They were locals. They knew where to go. They had their places to recommend, and it was amazing to kind of. So in a sense, my trip was it had my handwriting on it, but it also had the influence from very, very from a lot of people I met along the road, and that's really what I loved about it.
That's a really interesting point about the fact that some days are fantastic and other days are, as you put it, really shit.
Yeah.
But that's actually quite important, like you said, because it puts everything into perspective. If the sun shone every day, I'm sure people who live in countries where it does shine every day, they yearn for a day where it really chucks it down. And I think on a bike ride, a long bike ride, there are days where I've certainly experienced them where I think, God, what the hell am I doing? Why am I here? I don't want to do this. I'm tired. I'm in a bad mood. The weather's awful. But then the following day will be brilliant. And you think, yeah, this is why I do it. This is why I enjoy doing this. And I'm not sure whether I would enjoy it as much if it was a continuous sequence of good days, one after the other.
Yeah, I mean, it's just with a lot of other things. Of course, I remember some of the good times, that's kind of like, but I think what I remember still is the moments where I was struggling, and I think that's a good thing because it contributes to your experience. It shapes you as a person, and I think like if I'm looking back now where I am right now and just looking back at those situations, I can always look back onto those situations and say, look, this is what I was in. This is how I dealt with it. And I can also say like that things were better the next day. So I think you need to I'm not advocating for having bad experiences. Like I think no one really seeks out to have a shit day. That's quite normal and I wouldn't do that. But you just have to accept that the fact that comes with it every now and then. You can be a super positive person and there will still be days where you kind of like would like to throw the towel. And that's cool. And I think as long as you have a mechanism in place that those days are not going to impact on your journey, so you never scratch on it on a day like this, and never make a decision in this, but in those situations, because it's a bit like making big decisions right now. I think in a pandemic where we all, no matter how good we are coping with this, we are impacted by this, and it will have an impact on us in some shape or form. And I'm a bit more careful now. It's just things are not plannable. Things are, tough to foresee what's going to happen even in a few months' time. I think everything's up in the air, and I think one thing I remind myself is, I will be sailing through this in some shape or form, as I've been sailing through this on my around the world trip. And it's someday it's going to be over as well, like as any around the world trip will come to an end at times as well. And once you've been through it, you made those experiences, and actually the positive experience are going to be more positive because you actually really learn to soak them in and enjoy them while you can.
Shit days are always going to be shit days, but I think when you look back, they're a bit less shit than you actually probably thought they were at the time. So since coming back from the round the world trip, you've kind of established yourself as a mountain biker, off-road biker, trail rider, whatever the fashionable word is nowadays. And you're also quite an accomplished filmmaker, filming some of the trips that you do in Scotland and also around and about. Now, you've just made a film about Germany, not Scotland, but going back to Germany. And I think before we talk about that, we're just going to listen to the very start of your new film, because it'll put the whole thing into context.
And now the Soviets themselves may in a limited way be coming to understand the importance of freedom. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state, or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West or to strengthen the Soviet system without changing it? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
Okay, so that was Ronald Reagan, if you didn't recognise him, talking in probably the early mid-80s about the situation in Germany with East and West Germany and the changes that were beginning to take place. Now, this is relevant, obviously, to your trip in Germany. It's also relevant to your life, as you mentioned earlier, because you didn't just grow up in the old DDR, East Germany. You lived very close to the border.
Yeah, so the Reagan speech is from 1987, actually, when he was standing outside the Berlin Wall. And I think it was possibly when change started to happen. But yeah, my childhood, I grew up in the Eichsfeld, which is one of the regions that actually got divided into two by the former border. There was the western part, which was in Lower Saxony, and the eastern part, which was in Thuringia. And my grandparents both lived very close to the border. Like in real terms, if I would have known there is a border, you could almost see it from their house, but less than 2 kilometers away from the actual borderline. And it was interesting because, again, if I look back on this right now, for me, it was just normal. We had to, just to give you an idea what life was like, we lived in a small town, which was, there was no restrictions there. But whenever we traveled to our grandparents, we had to show a passing permit, which needed to be renewed on on a yearly basis, but I'm not sure about that detail. So each time we drove to my granny, we had to show a passing permit. And there's also other things. You were not allowed to kind of go anywhere near the border. So I think you could play on one side of my granny's house, but you weren't allowed to go up that hill and go into the forest. And I guess I can't remember if I ever questioned that as a child, but for me that was just normal. You know, I knew, like, I had no idea what the border looked like. The interesting thing about this is, and I think that was one of the reasons why I eventually did the film, is that my dad was traveling in that area, and he was a television technician, so he was the guy fixing people's televisions. And if you look back at the time back then, that was as important as having internet access. So being so close to the border, we could actually watch West German television, even at our own house. So I think, and again, for me, that was just normal. But I was also told by my parents, like, don't tell anyone that we're watching, West German television, because that would have got them into deep trouble. And we also had some parcels coming, like half of my mum's relatives lived in the West, and my dad's relatives as well. So my grandmothers both were able to travel to West Germany every now and then. But it took them, like, just to give you an idea, one of my grandmothers lived about 3 kilometers away from their relatives, but she had to travel a day to get there because she had to travel by train to the next border crossing and then back up by train again. So it's just hideous to kind of see those families torn into two pieces. And yeah, again, it's quite like I'm looking at this, and I think this is why all of this came up with the whole situation we're in at the moment. So, again, I'm in a situation right now where, I think I was so accommodated to just being able to travel to Germany from Scotland and meet, whenever I thought it was good and necessary to do so, I can do that. And at the moment, that's just not the case, for very different reason. And I'm always quite careful bringing the two things together because they are unrelated, But I think in a sense, the situation is, I think you kind of have to imagine that you can't just do things the way you want them to do. There will always be external factors that in some shape or form dictate what you can do and what you cannot do.
So as we know, the Berlin Wall and obviously the frontier between the old East and West Germany came down in the late 80s, early 90s. Now, for a long period, we're talking 45 years, that strip of land next to the border, this strip of land really was left from one end of Germany to another. And in the film, you decided to head up to the north of Germany and cycle all the way down. I think it's 700 kilometers or 700 miles, 700 kilometers all the way down to southern Germany, to the southern end of the border. Can you just talk a little bit about the route and where it goes, if people are not familiar with where the border is?
Yeah, the German part of the Iron Curtain, or the inner German border, was about 1,400 kilometers in total, which goes all the way from the Baltic Sea to the Czech. There's a triangle where the Czech Republic and Germany border on each other. And like the first 700 kilometer basically are fairly flat. Like northern Germany is possibly not as flat as a pancake, but very close to. The first significant hill is the Brocken mountain, and I would have wanted to start there, but I had a very limited time frame where I could travel, so decided to cycle the length of Thuringia. So to give you a little bit of East Germany was made out of 5 federal states, and the other 11 federal states are in the west. And Thuringia is one of the 5, and also one of the federal state that has the longest border with any other states. So, and it's where I was born. So for me, that made perfect sense just to do the journey within there. And like, I think the Green Belt is fascinating in a way, because if you look at Germany as a country, I think the one thing that would spring to my mind, if you look at a country with 82 million people squeezed on such a small landmass, it's very populated, and it is. I think, again, like looking at Scotland, there's very few people living on a big area, whereas Germany is a very different country. So the Green Belt, as it was left as no man's land, is one of the few areas really where there was not much influence from humans in terms of onto the nature. So you'll find some amazing ecosystems there. It was obviously influenced by building a massive big fence there and the control path, but there was not much else happening there, and I think that's the interesting thing. I would possibly describe it as one of the last wildernesses left in Germany, especially after. So what happened after the wall came down and the border was opened, like Germans were super quick to get rid of any evidence that it was ever there, understandably, because it was like always seen, people were so happy that it was gone, and except a few bits that were left for museums, that was it. So the only thing that remained is the Kolonnenweg, which is the patrol path that was used by vehicles. And that's basically still in existence all the way along the border. Anything else has been flattened. And what happened is there's like trees that self-seeded themselves in 1990, 1991, when all the work was done. And they've grown into 30-year-old trees now. So you cycle along a stretch where sometimes it's just wonderful doing that, especially in October, because it was such a colorful place to cycle. But yeah.
So you were following quite closely the route of the border. Now, some people might be familiar with Eurovelo 13,
Mm-hmm.
which is called the Iron Curtain Trail, and that starts up at the north of Norway and
Yeah.
follows what used to be the Iron Curtain, really, all the way down. I think it finishes in Bulgaria through 10,000 kilometers. To what extent does that route coincide with the route that you did? Because from what I understand, the route that you did is not actually a formal signposted route, is it?
No, it's a different route. And for me, to be frank and honest, I was kind of aware of the Eurovelo 14, but I also want to create a route that's basically my route. And just because there's a couple of reasons for that. In some parts of Thuringia, I had some really good local knowledge, and there were some landmarks I definitely wanted to include, which are not included in the Eurovelo 13. And I think the Eurovelo 14 for me is more designed for like a cycling tourist, whereas the route I've done is a proper bikepacking route. And I think what comes with bikepacking is a certain sense of adventure and kind of off-road riding as well. What I basically did is I found the GPX of the former borderline. I downloaded that, uploaded it into Komoot, and then selected gravel riding. And then I first let Komoot do its bit, and it does a good job at that, but then you also need to manually tweak it. And what I then was quite keen to take out as many bits as possible that go along the patrol path, because it's imagine it being big concrete slabs with gaps in between. So there's, I think, it's 21 gaps in each of the slabs, and they perfectly fit a gravel tire. So if you ride that with a fat bike, you'll be fine. But I also think riding a fat bike on a concrete path is also not my idea of fun. So wherever I think it was necessary, I left that bit in. So sometimes there's just no alternative to it, because it's been like the way they built the border is very interesting, because it was obviously following historic borderlines as well, mainly the Prussian border. So there are actually, like in most cases, there is actually a perfectly fine gravel track which runs parallel to the border. And my intention was to use those routes and combine them together and make my own. That's why it's called the Iron Curtain Gravel Trail, because it's a variation of some parts of the Kolonnenweg, which is also the route of the Grenzstein Trophy, which is quite a well-known bikepacking event in Germany. And then some parts of the Eurovelo 13, and anything in between is basically my own judgment, what I think is enjoyable on a gravel bike. And yeah.
Who actually owns that strip of land? Because presumably when the wall came down, when the border was taken away, was there a mad scramble for the land by farmers or by developers? I can imagine if it happened in Britain, for example, there'd now be a modern housing estate plonked on that land. Was it protected in any way by the government?
No, it wasn't at the beginning, and I think this is something, like, one thing that influenced me as well to do the film is just, I think it's quite interesting to dive a little bit deeper into what happened after the wall came down. So it wasn't rosy. Like, there was essentially what happened. You expose people who've lived in a socialism for about more than 40 years, and then they expose them to capitalism, and you leave them to adapt to that. And in a sense, that was possibly quite highly unfair to the people, because I look at things like my parents, for example, who they were just not natural entrepreneurs because the way they were brought up. It's interesting to kind of learn a little bit more about the history while you're planning a bikepacking route. So what happened, there was a lot of people who got taken the land off when, well, East Germany, basically everything was taken into state ownership. And obviously when the wall came down, people who were the original landowners were trying to claim that land back for good reasons, because they were, the owners of it. So there was a lot of toing and froing going on, and people reclaiming their land. So it was, for a while, there were people farming on that stretch, and it was just not like what wasn't taken into consideration straight after the wall came down is that this would actually make an amazing conservation zone, and it would also be what it is thankfully now one of the best long distance paths in the world to hike, for example. Like I would say the period from the 1990 to 1995, there was a lot of things happening in Germany that weren't beneficial. There was also, people leaving, especially in the East, people leaving their homes because they just couldn't find any work there any longer. So they had to go somewhere else. That left that part of Germany bereft of infrastructure. For example, there were pubs, there were shops in those villages, and pretty much all of them closed because there were just no people to either run them or to go into them. So I think it's a bit of a sad story if you look at that. But what happened after, and I don't know exactly the inside out of that, but I think what happened now is that a lot of the federal states were trying to buy back the land. And some of them have I think Saxony has bought pretty much the whole length of the Iron Curtain or the Green Belt back into state ownership, and obviously with the target to leave that as land left for conservation. I don't think the whole length is back into public ownership, but they're trying to do exactly that. I had a number of times where someone just was farming their cows and farming them straight across the Green Belt, which is obviously not really beneficial for that. So I think we will see those things disappearing more and more in the future.
You did a 700-kilometer stretch of this.
Mm-hmm.
If you were to recommend a shorter stretch, 100 kilometers, 200 kilometers, or which bit of the route that you did would you recommend that people perhaps look into doing themselves?
Possibly a bit biased on that one, but I think the Eichsfeld is a fantastic place to go. It's got the unique thing that was the region that was divided into two by the border. So, and there's some historical things possibly a lot of people don't really know about. Is there was the Wanfried Agreement. So there's a place called Wanfried. So if I like to, just in real terms, let's say if you want to cycle only 100 kilometers, I would start in Teistungen, where there's a border museum, and go from Teistungen to, let's say, Wanfried, or kind of somewhere in the Werra Valley. You will end up somewhere there. And so Wanfried is an interesting place because there was a railway line. So the border was set, and it was basically an agreement between the French, American, Russian, and British troops. And the Americans recognized that one of the main railways was going to East German territory or to Russian territory, and it was the railway they needed to supply their forces in the north from the bases in the south. So it's really, really essential to keep that railway in American territory, or in either American, French, or British territory. So there were two villages that originally belonged to East Germany that were transferred into West Germany or into the American sector. And in exchange, there were three villages that used to be West Germany that got transferred into East Germany. And that's exactly where I grew up. Never knew really that. Like as a child, I was never taught that at school. I think if you do a bit of reading about that section, it's also an utterly stunningly beautiful part of Germany in terms of landscapes. Like there's some beautiful native forests. Yeah, just some old castles and things like this. Some, I think if you look at the stereotypical German image of, nice 400, 500 years old houses, that's exactly what you get there. Having that in the back of your head and cycling to those places. And actually what I tried sometimes to do is to put myself into the shoes of those people. So, you imagining when I cycled next to the border, I was looking over where the fence used to be and to the other side. And I was just trying to imagine what it would be like if I would be in East Germany and I would be looking over to the west, which for many years was the land of all opportunities, and it's literally, it's a stone throw away, but it's a totally different world. So I think, in that particular stretch, I think you'll get a really good sense for that.
Yeah, the film itself is a beautiful little film. It's not very long. It's only about 10 minutes long, although I think there are other bits and pieces that you've posted on your YouTube channel, which you can find I think it's
It's Reizkultur, which is a very weird nickname I'm using. It's Reizkultur. But I think if you Google my name and YouTube, you'll eventually end up there as well.
yeah, it's a beautiful little film. What kind of equipment did you use to film it?
Quite simple. So like all the films I'm doing for now, it's basically stuff I can carry on the bike. So I had a drone with me, a DJI Mavic Pro drone, without the remote controller, just controlling it from my mobile phone. Then an iPhone 7 Plus or S, Plus or S, one of those, the bigger one, which I use for filming. A Canon G7X camera, compact camera, mainly for stills. I use it for some filming as well, and then a DJI Osmo Pocket, which is a tiny little handheld gimbal, and that was it.
You had 4 cameras, but
Yeah.
these are very small cameras. And in
Yeah.
terms of the drone footage, I'm always I've never driven a drone in my life. I've never photographed with a drone, and I'm always intrigued when people do use them for the films. Do you ask for permission to use them in certain areas, or are you free to just use them at will?
I'm a professional pilot, so I've got a license and insurance to fly it, because it involves some of my project are sponsored or paid for by other people. So I think so in the UK, it really depends on where you are. I think it's regardless of the law, I think it's good practice to ask people for permission. But to do that on a trip like this is pretty much impossible because you don't know when you're going to be at a certain point. So what I try most of the time is just to take off on public roads, which are public land. So there's not going to be any land ownership issues involved in that. There's also some sensitivities around landmarks, for example. I try not to, whenever you look at the footage, there's just one scene in there which involves the Hanstein Castle, which is very clearly identifiable as a landmark, but anything else, I think it's quite tricky to understand where it's actually been shot. This film is interesting because basically the films I make are 2 different kinds. There's the ones like Grenzerfahrung, which was shot on the journey, and you basically I had no idea what footage I'm going to be able to capture because it depends on so many factors. It depends on daylight, depends on where the sun is, it depends on what the weather is like. So with the drone, you can't fly it in high winds, you can't fly it in any sort of rain. I think with the drone, I really like it as a tool, but I'm trying to limit using it to a certain amount each day. That's mainly because I need mains power to charge the batteries, so I can charge everything else, which I have with me from a USB power pack, but that one piece needs to be charged for mains power, so you need to be somewhere close. And the whole thing of going into a restaurant or cafe in COVID-19 times doesn't really work. So it's gonna be, it throws up some logistical challenges every now and then. Drone footage is great and it works to a certain extent, and I think for that film it was really, really good to give people an idea what things are actually looking from above, because then you real, like with the border fortifications, you get a real sense for what the extent of those are. You won't get that perspective by just filming a fence. For me, filmmaking is art in a certain way. And if you look at the films, I think my films have become slower. They've become much more detailed. And like in terms of footage, what makes a better film is actually the stuff, like the very fine detail. There's always some big picture stuff, that's the drone footage, but I'm really interested in kind of covering all bases.
Yeah, and we'll actually come to that in a second when we talk about your film about the John Muir Way. On the subject of drones, you gave a talk a few days ago at the Cycle Touring Festival. One of the films that is being shown as part of the festival this year, which is online, is one called Pamir to Karakoram, and it was filmed in Central Asia along the border between China and Pakistan, and that was a young French-Scottish couple, and they've made a very interesting film about their cycle in that area, but they did take a drone with them. And if you watch the film, at the end, they crash the drone, and unfortunately, they lose a lot of the footage that they took, which in that area would have been spectacular. You can imagine the kind of mountains they've got there. But it did make me think, if I went to that part of the world, the border between Pakistan, Afghanistan, China, would I be going round driving a drone in those kind of frontier areas?
I didn't, because I think when I went to Kyrgyzstan, I left my drone consciously behind for a number of reasons. I think from a very practical point of view, I think like if you travel to Germany with a drone, no one would question that in your luggage. It's just it's nothing exceptional these days. If you go into any of those countries, it's possibly going to be a bit of a challenge to get it into the country because they'll be suspicious and they possibly just don't know what it is.
Yeah, I'd say, and you could have some American fighter jet coming and shooting your drone from the sky, I would have thought. But
yeah, and I mean, in terms of the footage thing, this is possibly as anything in life, is a learning curve. So you will, in an ideal world, I save the footage after each day somewhere. On that trip, it was just not possible. On other trips, Trovers and the John Muir film, for example, I was able to get to a laptop in the evening and just save the footage. That's my first task I do, having a cup of coffee and putting the memory card into something and just making a backup, because there's nothing worse. I had similar experiences where I lost a whole day of shooting just by a very silly function on the drone that was overriding each take. So but you learn. But I think so when I went to Kyrgyzstan, I think there's also another thing. It's you have to be a bit culturally sensitive about this as well. For Kyrgyzstan, for me, my thinking was basically I'm going into these amazing mountains and into this vast landscapes which are very cinematic by themselves, even if you just film them with a normal handheld phone. If I would have flown a drone there, I thought I'm imposing something on those people who ride around on horses and live in yurts, and this is possibly something very different. Of course, if there would have been a professionally commissioned production, then it's a different case, but for Kyrgyzstan, it was a bit of a no-brainer to leave the drone behind. And I also had no like in Kyrgyzstan, it was you go for days without being able to charge anything other than using your dynamo hub. So for me, it was just like I can possibly fly the drone 1 or 2 days and I'll have to go 6 or 7 days without it. So what's the point in taking it initially? So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't realize that you'd actually made a film about Kyrgyzstan. I'll go back and watch that because it sounds quite interesting. But the whole drone stuff kind of brings us to the film that you made about the John Muir Way, because there you did use a drone, and I have to say it is a beautiful, beautiful film. The John Muir Way is a 135-mile walking stroke cycling route from Helensburgh in the west of Scotland to Dunbar in the east of Scotland. Can you talk about that particular route, and also about John Muir? Who is John Muir, and why was it named after him?
Yeah, so the film was released in October last year. It was shot in July last year. No, July actually. There's a couple of things that attracted me to that. I think John Muir, let's start with John Muir. John Muir is one of those highly influential people. You possibly will have seen quotes from him popping up every now and then on the internet. Like I think if you look on Instagram is possibly full of John Muir quotes in some shape or form. And that's what he's possibly best known for. He's a Scotsman who was born in Dunbar, a small coastal town, and at a very early age emigrated to the US and then became the founder of the national park movement in the US. That in itself is a massive achievement. I've been talking about this beforehand. There is also, back in the days when he was living, he made comments about Native Americans, which are totally off. I still think he had a very significant impact in what he was doing. John Muir was one of the earliest people, I think, in the US to come up with the idea that we actually need to preserve nature for our own well-being. And it was with his writing. His writing at times is utterly beautiful. It's very, very picturesque and really nice. And that kind of influenced me in the film. So, I think doing a film about the John Muir Way. So the John Muir Way was founded to have a route that goes from his birthplace in Dunbar to the West Coast, where eventually he would have left to America somewhere. I don't know where he actually left from, which port. but there is no real connection with him as such along the route, other than that it starts at his birthplace or finishes at his birthplace, and there's a museum in Dunbar as well. And it goes along some of the rocks he was playing as a child. Once you come past Dunbar and the surroundings, there's nothing really that's connected to Muir, and that's in that sense. But I think the route is very interesting because it's exactly that philosophy. So it goes to one of the most populated areas in Scotland, and although Scotland, not being like an overcrowded country as such, the Central Belt is very built up and has very little nature. And I found it interesting that a route that's named after John Muir goes exactly to that, and not, for example, to the Central Highlands. But I think when I was traveling the route, I could really make a connection between Muir and the route, because although you're in these heavily populated areas, you'll have at least a little sense of what wilderness feels like. And there might just be a pocket. It might just be a forest. There's a beautiful bit of forest next to the Falkirk Wheel, one of the biggest achievements in engineering in Scotland, and all of a sudden you go from that into this very small, nice part of forest, and you kind of think like those two things can actually coexist with each other. And I think that's the essence of the route. So it's a route that gives you the wilderness of bikepacking at times, but it also takes you to civilization, that's what I would call it. And I think it's exactly that contrast that is really interesting. And I think Muir was a very curious person as well. So he was a conservationist and he was very interested in nature, but he was also building things. He was a very talented person in terms of engineering. So, if you look at things like the Falkirk Wheel or the Avon Aqueduct, or some other bits which are along the route, I was always putting myself into his shoes. Like, imagine John Muir on a bicycle if he would cycle through there. What are the things he would be interested in? And, something like the Falkirk Wheel would have utterly fascinated him. So I think it's a nice route for that.
The commentary that you add is really beautiful. And what we'll do, we'll just pause there and we'll listen to just a short bit of the commentary where you are reflecting upon perhaps your longer trips that you've done and these shorter trips which are less, in inverted commas, adventurous.
While I can still cover big distances and experience the landscape changing throughout the days, I discovered another advantage of using my bike. I can stop everywhere. And so, as time moved on, I grew fonder of the beauty that I found by slowing down. My journeys became less about cycling and more about my surroundings. I realized that most times it doesn't need an adventure on an epic scale to keep close to nature's heart. At times, a micro-adventure after work or weekend away will do the trick. While my appetite for big adventures is still strong, I use my time more often to stop and listen, to enjoy what happens in the world immediately around me.
So that was you reflecting upon the nature of the journey and how it's a very different experience from perhaps cycling long distances. It's also one of the things that struck me when I watched it. It's called Unhurried, by the way, and you'll find it again on your YouTube channel. But one of the other things that I noticed, apart from the drone footage, apart from it being so beautiful, apart from the commentary, was it was almost like a nature documentary sometimes. There's a lot of flora and fauna in there.
Which is very interesting because when I was setting out to do the filming of the thing, I think the least thing I would have thought about is to capture footage of flora and fauna. It was just because if you think about the nature of the route, that's just not what you expect. But the interesting thing is, like, if you're going to very remote parts of Scotland, there's potentially very few things you'll see. Whereas if you do the John Muir Way, there's loads of things that can grab your attention, like the swans, ducks, frogs, whatever, all of those little things. And it's just something I wouldn't necessarily think about in the first instance when I think about bikepacking. But there is also the reason for choosing unhurried, because the beauty of the route is that it is a fairly short journey compared to other bikepacking routes. So it's 134 miles. Really depends on how long you want to take. You can do this in a day at the most extreme, or you can do it in 7 or 14 days, whatever, even if you just cycle 5 miles a day or 10 miles a day. I mean, it's perfectly fine to do that. There's enough to do, to sit down and discover nature in a very different way. That was the thing for me. And yeah, it was utterly beautiful in its own sense. The thing that I find really attractive about the route is not the stereotypical Scotland. It's not the big open mountain landscapes, although there's a few at the western side of the route. It's a very different Scotland. Personally, for me, it's actually much more interesting. There's some really interesting stories connected to that, and you'll also meet people. It's mainly local people you meet. There's places you go along, like the Falkirk Wheel, that are tourist hotspots, yes, but the majority of the route doesn't take you along any Instagram hotspots or whatsoever, and you can make up your own mind what you think is beautiful or not, and that's essentially what I try to capture. My way of filmmaking has become very slow, actually, because for me that's important. And it's a bit contrary to some of the other stuff I've done. I'm a keen racer as well, and I love to race. And I also think there's a space for that as well. But I think the nice thing about being on a bicycle is that you can take it very slow and you can stop everywhere. That's the cool thing. You don't have to look for a parking space or whatsoever. You can just stop in most cases, put your bike down, sit there and relax. And that's what I did. And this is when I discovered all the, weird and wonderful things around me. And that's a beautiful thing.
I actually cycled part of the John Muir Way when I went round Britain last summer, and I got up to Dunbar, and I'd stayed overnight with Suzanne Forup. She escorted me up to North Berwick. We went our separate ways there, and I kind of continued through all these golf courses along that north coast into Edinburgh, and then followed the canal. After Falkirk, I branched off to the south, whereas the John Muir Way heads more to the west. The first part of the route between Dunbar and Edinburgh, fantastic. The second part that I took, unfortunately, it must have been one of the wettest days on record in Scotland. And I got to the Falkirk Wheel, and I spent about an hour just sitting inside the visitor centre trying to warm up and to dry. As long as you pick a decent day to be there, it is a beautiful route, and I would certainly love one day to go back and to continue along that route, which does eventually take me to Helensburgh.
I think bikepacking for a long time has been perceived as this very fit people going very long distances, I think, in a sense that, and I do think that something like the John Muir Way has a great potential to make this much more attractive to a much wider range of people, simply by the fact that you can jump on the train if you want to. So there's frequent train stations along it. You also don't have to care really too much about what you kind of have to take in terms of food. I mean, the most extreme trip I've done was possibly cycling across Patagonia 8 days without food. And that takes some serious planning to do that. And I think it's possibly like what a lot of people would consider as extreme. The John Muir Way is not any of this. I think it brings you the good bits of bikepacking, at least in small pockets. I think it's a good route for people to get hooked on, actually enjoying that sort of cycle touring as well. I don't think there's any difference between cycle touring and bikepacking. It's just possibly different bags you strap on your bike, but other than that, the mindset's the same. That's a nice thing. You can have that, but you have that with a little bit of a backup option, and that makes it a bit more attractive and a bit less intimidating than telling someone you have to be self-sufficient for 1,000 kilometers.
Yeah, I think perhaps that's what I should have done. I should have jumped on the train in Edinburgh and taken the train at least to Glasgow.
Yeah.
The following day, I think it got a lot better. But hey, that's the weather in Britain all over, isn't it? One day good, and then one day not so good. Right, just to finish off with, Cateran Eco Museum.
So the Cateran Eco Museum is a museum without walls. So it's basically an area in Eastern Perthshire and Angus. And it's an area which is full of history, and evident history in forms like standing stones, old churches, historic pathways. So the idea of the museum is that people can actually walk through the landscape and see history while they're doing this. And I love this, I think, because a lot of my route planning, bikepacking is influenced by stories, by history. A lot of my output is storytelling. I think, like, even if you look at pictures, they tell a story, and in many ways they tell my own personal story. So I think it's really interesting to kind of giving people the ability to walk through a landscape and really understand where we come from. And so the idea behind the Cateran Eco Museum is that, but it's also what Claire and the other directors have set out, that people can actually experience climate change while it happens. I think climate change is coming home to people now, that it is a very real issue, but for me, sometimes it's kind of been dealt with as this theoretic construct, and the Cateran Eco Museum is a place that's always been influenced by changes. And I think the idea behind it is that people can actually experience what's happening, what's changing in the landscape while they're visiting it. And in a sense, experience what will be history in a couple of 100 years' time, in the here and now.
So this is the area just to the north of Perth and Dundee. It's quite a small area. It kind of just touches onto the Cairngorm National Park by the looks of it. Mm-hmm. Your involvement in this has been to design routes, to make videos?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the work I've been doing is I'm very keen on and not using it as a buzzword, because I think it's used as a buzzword too many times. It's the whole idea of sustainable tourism, and how can we... I honestly believe it's very important for people to go to different places and to have those experiences, because I think it's necessary to experience different cultures. But I think what we need to be thinking about is what our impact with doing that is. I think, do we need to fly overseas for long stretches, or can we experience some of that back home as well? I'm also guilty for flying around the world. My carbon footprint is not great, and I'm well aware of that. But the idea basically behind it is to offer people an alternative to the conventional idea of tourism, which in my eyes often is to fly to a place, spend 14 days there, or drive around Scotland miles and miles, and go from place to place, and not really being able to actually understanding the places you're going to. So in an ideal world, we'd like people to come there, we'd like people to stay there for a bit longer than just one night, and to do what they do either by walking or cycling. But I think what is very crucial for that is that if we really want to establish alternatives, we need to give people credible incentives to do so. So we need to offer them some bits to do. And I think this is the fascinating thing about the Cateran Eco Museum. It's not just about designing a cycle route. It's designing a cycle route that caters to very different abilities and very different tastes of people as well, but also takes them to very interesting places. That's the whole idea behind the museum. So, past stone circles and pretty nice things. And there's also activities available. So one example, for example, you could do a course and build a coracle, which is like an ancient boat. So you can build your own coracle. How you're going to get that home on a bike might be quite tricky. But it's very much about that. And I think for a lot of the stuff I'm doing, I'm trying to be an example without preaching to people. Like, I think the reality in the UK is that a lot of the holidays you really need to have a car, because you won't get from A to B with a family of 4 on a train and bicycles. I think that's the harsh reality at the moment. And I think so we're also thinking about, can people hire bikes there? So, if they don't want to take their own bikes, can we make sure that we've got the infrastructure in place that people can actually still enjoy that? Tourism is sometimes perceived as something intrusive into communities. And I don't think it should be that. To be successful, I think people really need to see this as part of their own community and actually, see the benefits of it, the benefits of having people with different opinions coming to your own area. Because I think it's an amazing thing to do. If I would be running a B&B, I'd be very much looking forward to the stories that people tell me that visit the place as much as I want to tell my own stories. So this project for me is so exciting because it's not just thinking about a cycle route, it's thinking about all the other things that go with it as well, and hopefully providing something credible for people to do as an alternative to the here and now.
Yeah, and for anybody who kind of didn't catch the word there, it's Cateran. It's Cateran, Cateran Eco Museum, and there's a good website, cateranecomuseum.co.uk, that you can visit. It's been fascinating chatting with you. I think back over the last 25, 30 podcasts, I don't think I've ever discussed with one person so many different places. We've been to New Zealand, we've been to Scotland, we've been to Germany, we've been to Kazakhstan, we've been to Central Asia, we've been to probably other places as well that I've forgotten. Congratulations, you win an award for actually managing to get as many places in there as possible. If people want more information about you and your travels and your work, they can go to markusstitz.com. That's Markus with a K, Stitz, STITZ.com, and you're on Instagram at Rise Culture. I've said that wrong. How do you say? What's the best way of saying it?
Rise Culture.
Yeah, that's REIZKULTUR. And I would thoroughly recommend people visiting your YouTube channel, which you can find, I'm sure, quite easily if you Google it, because there are some really beautiful films on there. They're not massive epics. They're not 2-3 hours long. They're nice, short-ish films, all about cycling, but more than just cycling. They're about all the other things that you've just been talking about, really, when it comes to the Eco Museum and that kind of thing. So thank you for that, and good luck with your future travels.
Thank you, and thanks for the chat. Really enjoyed it. Cool.